A young black woman walks into court, wearing a modest, slightly worn suit, clutching a stack of legal folders. Just the public defender. A senior, million-dollar defense attorney sneers, mocks, and publicly humiliates her in front of everyone. What no one knows, she secretly owns the law firm that just bought his entire practice overnight. And when the judge himself rises, calls her ma'am, and the jaws drop, you'll see what real power looks like. Before we see what happens next, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story already has you cheering, don't forget to smash that like button. The air in courtroom 4B was thick and heavy, smelling of old paper, stale coffee, and the low-grade anxiety that seeped from the pores of everyone present. It was a space built for judgment, with dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb sound and light, and high ceilings that made every whisper feel like a public announcement. The jury sat in their box, a collection of tired faces trying to follow the complex dance of legal arguments. In the gallery, a mix of family members, law students, and bored onlookers watched the proceedings with varying degrees of attention. At the center of it all, Gregory Hale stood like a king in his own court. He was a man carved from arrogance, dressed in a suit that cost more than the average person's car. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his posture was impeccable, and his voice, a rich baritone honed over decades of courtroom battles, filled the space with an unshakable confidence. He was a senior partner at Hale & Dawson, a firm known for defending the wealthy and powerful, and he treated this courtroom as his personal stage. Camille Bryant stood a few feet away, a stark contrast to the scene Greg commanded. Her suit was a simple dark gray, clean and pressed, but showing the subtle signs of wear around the cuffs. It was the kind of suit you bought for your first real job interview, not the kind you wore to command a courtroom. In her arms, she held a stack of manila folders, thick with the weight of her caseload as a public defender. Her clients didn't have trust funds, they had pride. They didn't have influence, they had desperation. And she was their only line of defense. She waited for a pause in Greg's eloquent, almost theatrical monologue. He was in the middle of dismantling the prosecution's witness, a task he performed with the casual cruelty of a cat toying with a mouse. When he finally paused for a dramatic sip of water, Camille saw her chance. She took a small step forward, her sensible shoes making no sound on the polished floor. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear, respectful but firm. "Your Honor," she began, her eyes fixed on Judge Rebecca Stone, who presided from the elevated bench. "If I may have a moment to address the court regarding a point of procedure." Before Judge Stone could even open her mouth to respond, a sound erupted from Greg Hale's table. It was a laugh. Not a chuckle, but a full-throated, mocking bark of amusement that cut through the courtroom's tense silence like a rock through a stained glass window. Every head turned toward him. He was looking at Camille, a wide, incredulous smirk plastered on his face. He shook his head slowly, as if he had just witnessed a child attempt to explain quantum physics. "A point of procedure," he echoed, his voice dripping with condescending disbelief. He turned his body to face the jury, a conspiratorial smile on his lips. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, forgive the interruption. It seems our public defender has something to say." He said the words public defender as if they were a disease, a stain on the hallowed ground of his courtroom. The jurors shifted uncomfortably. Some exchanged confused glances, while others looked down, avoiding the spectacle. In the clerk's station, a young man named Kevin Tran froze, his pen hovering over a document. His eyes, wide and troubled, darted from Greg's sneering face to Camille's calm but isolated figure. Greg wasn't finished. He took a step toward Camille, invading her personal space, forcing her to look up at him. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, though his tone conveyed no respect at all, "I have to question the relevance of any interruption from this quarter." He gestured vaguely at Camille with a dismissive wave of his hand. "How long have you been practicing, dear? 6 months? A year?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned again to the jury and the gallery, his voice rising. "Are we really going to pause a serious trial? A trial concerning the liberty of my client, to entertain a challenge from someone probably fresh out of law school? Someone who is only here because the state pays her to be." The insult hung in the air, sharp and ugly. He was not just questioning her experience, He was questioning her right to be there, her value, her very presence. He was painting her as an obstacle, a nuisance funded by taxpayers, while he was the champion of justice, the high-priced warrior for the elite. Some of Greg's junior associates, sitting behind him, smirked in nervous approval. In the back of the gallery, a few low chuckles could be heard, people siding with the man in the expensive suit. The courtroom had fallen utterly silent, a vacuum of shock and discomfort. Camille did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She did not return his sneer. Her gaze remained steady, her posture unchanged. The knuckles of the hand clutching her folders had turned white, the only outward sign of the pressure she felt. She held his gaze for a beat, letting his arrogance hang in the air for everyone to see. Then she turned her head back to the bench, her focus entirely on the judge. "Your Honor," she repeated, her voice as calm and even as before. "May I speak?" Her quiet dignity was a stark contrast to Greg's loud, preening display. Judge Stone, a woman with decades of experience, watched the exchange over the top of her glasses, her expression unreadable. She looked from Greg's smirking face to Camille's resolute one. After a long, heavy pause, she finally spoke, her voice a low rumble of authority. "You may proceed, Miss Bryant, but the damage was done." Greg, with a final theatrical wave of his hand, had already turned his back on Camille, dismissing her completely. He had won the moment, casting her as an irrelevant amateur in front of the entire court. He had made her small, and in the silence that followed, as Camille tried to make her point, Greg's arrogant outburst echoed louder than any words she could say. Greg Hale felt a surge of satisfaction. He had put the young public defender in her place, and the ripple of amusement through the courtroom was all the validation he needed. He lived for these moments, these small power plays that affirmed his status at the top of the legal food chain. He saw Judge Stone's reluctant permission not as a victory for Camille, but as a minor formality before he could resume his command of the room. He was determined to shut her down completely. As Camille opened her mouth to speak again, he stepped forward, his body physically blocking her from the judge's line of sight. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial growl that was still loud enough for the jury and the front rows to hear. "Sit down, Miss Bryant," he hissed, the words sharp and venomous. He pointed a long manicured finger toward her simple wooden chair. "You are embarrassing yourself." The directness of the command, the sheer, unvarnished condescension, sent a fresh wave of shock through the room. This was no longer just legal maneuvering, it was a public shaming. Camille's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Her knuckles, still wrapped around her folder, were now bone white. She felt a familiar fire ignite in her belly, the same fire that had fueled her through countless late nights in law school, through moments of doubt and discrimination. It was the fire of her father's memory, a man who had been crushed by the casual cruelty of men just like Greg Hale. But she had learned long ago that fire was best used as fuel, not as a wildfire. To let her anger show now would be to hand him the victory he so desperately craved. She had to remain calm. She had to follow the plan. From his desk, Kevin Tran watched, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and helplessness. He saw the subtle tension in Camille's shoulders, the rigid set of her jaw. He saw Greg's sneering face, his chest puffed out with pride. Kevin felt a deep gut-level revulsion. He had seen lawyers get heated before, but this was different. This was personal. This was cruel. Greg wasn't just arguing a case, he was trying to break a person. Greg, emboldened by her silence, pressed his attack. His rant became more personal, more venomous. "This isn't a classroom, Miss Bryant. This is the real world, where consequences are real, and people's lives are on the line," he said, his voice rising to a self-righteous crescendo. "We can't all get by on affirmative action and good intentions." The words affirmative action landed like a punch to the gut. He had crossed a line, moving from professional arrogance to outright racial insinuation. He was implying that she, a young black woman, hadn't earned her place, that she was a diversity hire, who was out of her depth. The air in the courtroom grew thick and cold. The smirks on the faces of Greg's junior partners faded, replaced by uneasy, shifting eyes. Even the jurors who had been amused before now looked on with stony expressions. They were no longer watching a legal debate. They were witnessing a public humiliation. Greg had misjudged the room. His desire to dominate had led him to reveal a deep-seated ugliness, and now even his allies were beginning to recoil. Camille knew this was the moment. He had given her exactly what she needed. He had shown his true colors for everyone to see. She let the silence stretch, allowing his toxic words to poison the atmosphere he had tried so hard to control. Then she looked away from him, deliberately breaking his intense, bullying gaze. She looked directly into the eyes of the jury, one by one. Her expression was not one of defeat, but of a quiet, profound disappointment. She held their gaze for a long moment, forging a silent connection, a shared understanding of the injustice they had all just witnessed. Then, in a voice that was soft but carried across the silent room, she said two simple words to Greg, without even looking at him. "Thank you, counselor." It was brilliant. It was disarming. It was not the angry retort he expected, nor the tearful retreat he hoped for. It was an acknowledgement, spoken with the quiet grace of a victor. She was thanking him for showing everyone exactly who he was. With those two words, she took a small, deliberate step back and returned to her seat, placing her folder neatly on the table in front of her. The courtroom was frozen. Jaws had literally dropped. The smug confidence on Greg's face finally flickered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had expected a fight, and instead, he had been dismissed with a quiet, polite, "Thank you." Kevin Tran watched Camille sit down, her back ramrod straight. He felt a surge of awe. She had lost the battle for the floor, but she had just won the war for the room's respect. And in that moment, seeing her quiet strength in the face of such ugliness, Kevin made a silent vow. He would not let this go. He would not forget what he had just seen. The sleek, minimalist office was a world away from the stuffy, oppressive atmosphere of courtroom 4B. Here, the air was clean and cool, filtered and silent. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline. On the frosted glass door, elegant silver letters spelled out a name that was unknown to the public, but whispered with reverence in the highest echelons of corporate law: Bryant Legal Holdings. Inside, sitting at a massive desk made of polished chrome and dark mahogany, was Camille Bryant. But this was not the modest, slightly worn public defender from the courtroom. This was CEO Bryant, the architect of a legal empire. Her hair, which had been pulled back in a simple, functional bun at court, was now down, cascading over the shoulders of a sharp, impeccably tailored blazer. This was the Camille who negotiated multi-billion-dollar mergers, who dismantled corporations with the stroke of a pen, who commanded boardrooms with a quiet authority that made grown men tremble. Earlier that morning, just hours before she had stepped into that courtroom, she had been sitting in this very chair, performing the final act of a plan she had set in motion years ago. A stack of documents lay before her, the culmination of months of secret negotiations, financial maneuvering, and strategic planning. The top page was a purchase agreement. With a smooth, confident stroke of a fountain pen, she signed her name on the final line. The ink was barely dry on the deal that officially and irrevocably transferred the entire ownership of Hale & Dawson, one of the city's oldest and most prestigious law firms, to her company, Bryant Legal Holdings. The firm of the man who would later mock her as a budget defender now belonged to her. Every partner, every asset, every case file, and every employee, including Gregory Hale himself, was now under her command. This was not just business for Camille. This was deeply, profoundly personal. Her motive was not profit. It was justice. A faded photograph sat on the corner of her desk, away from the corporate documents. It showed a smiling man in a simple janitor's uniform, his arm wrapped around a young, bright-eyed girl with braids. The man was her father, Samuel Bryant. Years ago, Samuel had worked as a janitor at Hale & Dawson. He was a proud, hard-working man who took immense pride in his work, who believed in honesty and dignity above all else. But he had been fired, dismissed without cause, and without dignity. He had been accused of something he didn't do, a scapegoat for a minor administrative error made by one of the firm's partners. He was humiliated, stripped of his livelihood and his good name by the very firm whose floors he cleaned. The stress and shame had broken his spirit, and he had passed away not long after, a man defeated by the casual arrogance of the powerful. Camille had never forgotten. She had carried that injustice with her through every grueling year of law school, through every sleepless night building her empire. She had promised herself, promised her father's memory, that one day she would hold the people responsible to account. That day was today. The acquisition was her ultimate checkmate, but she needed to see one more thing for herself. She wanted to know if the culture of arrogance and cruelty that had destroyed her father still festered within the walls of Hale and Dawson. She needed to know if Gregory Hale, the firm's public face and senior partner, had changed at all, so she devised a plan. She took on a pro bono public defender case, a case that she knew would put her directly in Greg Hale's path. She would enter his world not as a conquering CEO, but as the very thing he despised most: a young, black, female public defender. It was the perfect disguise. She would be his blind spot. After signing the final papers, she stood and walked over to a private closet. Her COO, a sharp woman named Maria, watched her with a knowing look. "Are you sure about this, Camille?" Maria asked, her voice laced with concern. "We could just announce the merger. We could fire him from here." Camille shook her head, a determined glint in her eye. "No," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "I need to see him. I need to look him in the eye. I need to give him one last chance to show me he's a decent human being." She turned to her legal team, a group of high-powered attorneys who had been orchestrating the takeover behind the scenes. "No one says a word until I give the signal," she commanded. "The merger is to remain confidential. As far as the world is concerned, nothing has changed at Hale and Dawson. Is that clear?" They all nodded in unison, their faces a mixture of respect and awe. Camille then disappeared into the closet and emerged a few minutes later, transformed. The power blazer was gone, replaced by the simple, modest grey suit. Her hair was pulled back into the tight bun. The millionaire CEO was gone. In her place stood Camille Bryant, public defender. She picked up her worn leather briefcase and the stack of case files and walked out of the gleaming office, her face a mask of calm resolve. She was heading to court, fully aware of the humiliation that was waiting for her, ready to walk into the lion's den, not as prey, but as the secret owner of the entire zoo. While Camille was stepping into her role as the underestimated public defender, Gregory Hale was basking in the gilded cage of his own ego. The hallways of Hale and Dawson were a monument to his success. The floors were polished marble, the walls were adorned with expensive modern art, and the air hummed with the quiet, confident energy of money and power. Greg strode through these halls like a conquering hero returning from battle. His courtroom victory as he saw it was the talk of the firm. He had just returned from his lunch, a 3-martini affair with a wealthy client, and was now holding court with a group of junior associates, young, ambitious lawyers who hung on his every word. "You see that?" he boasted, his voice booming in the hallway. "That's how you handle these little gnats. You don't argue with them, you crush them." He laughed, and the junior associates laughed with him. A chorus of nervous, sycophantic chuckles. "Some little public defender thinks she can waltz into my courtroom and challenge me. Doesn't she know who I am?" He puffed out his chest, the picture of self-satisfaction. "Mark my words," he continued, wagging a finger at the young lawyers. "Black public defenders don't scare millionaires. They are a nuisance, a box to be checked by the state. Nothing more." His arrogance was a force field, deflecting any hint of reality. On his massive mahogany desk, a stack of unread memos was piling up. His email inbox was flooded with notifications marked urgent and confidential, immediate action required. They were communications from Bryant Legal Holdings, official notices of the change in ownership, requests for emergency board meetings, and new corporate protocols. But Greg didn't check his emails. He considered it beneath him, a task for his assistant. He didn't read memos. He made them. He was so insulated by his own sense of importance that he had become completely blind to the storm that was gathering just outside his office door. The audience, armed with the knowledge of Camille's secret, could see the train barreling down the tracks, while Greg stood blissfully unaware, admiring his reflection in the polished marble. This dramatic irony created a thick, palpable tension, a delicious anticipation of the moment his world would come crashing down. Other partners in the firm, older men who had seen Greg's ego grow to monstrous proportions over the years, heard his bragging from their own offices. Some of them rolled their eyes. They had grown weary of his constant need for validation, his bullying tactics, his belief that he was the firm, but they did nothing to stop him. For years, Greg's aggressive style had brought in massive profit. They had all benefited from his ruthlessness, so they had learned to look the other way. His arrogance was the price of their comfortable lives, and they had long ago decided it was a price they were willing to pay. They had no idea that the bill was about to come due, and that the price would be far higher than any of them could have imagined. Greg, meanwhile, was oblivious. He dismissed the junior associates and sauntered into his corner office, the one with the best view of the city. He loosened his tie, poured himself a glass of expensive scotch from the crystal decanter on his bar, and smiled at his reflection in the window. He was Gregory Hale. He was untouchable, and he was about to be so. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as the day's proceedings came to a close. Kevin Tran packed his bag, his mind still replaying the ugly scene from the morning. He couldn't shake the image of Camille Bryant's face, her quiet dignity in the face of Greg Hale's venomous attack. He had seen many lawyers in his time as a clerk, from the brilliant to the incompetent, the compassionate to the cruel, but he had never seen anyone handle public humiliation with such grace. It stuck with him. He felt a nagging curiosity, a need to understand who this woman was. On a whim, he pulled out his phone and did a quick search for her. He found a listing for her as a public defender, but not much else. He looked her up on LinkedIn, expecting to see a profile detailing her law school, her past experience, her accomplishments. But the profile was almost completely blank. There was a name, a simple headshot, and nothing else. No connections, no job history, no educational background. It was strange. In a world where everyone was desperate to broadcast their credentials, her online presence was a void. It was as if she didn't exist outside of that courtroom. The mystery only deepened his interest. As he left the courthouse, he saw her. Camille was standing on the sidewalk, not looking triumphant or defeated, but simply present. She was talking to a young woman who was crying, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. The young woman was clearly one of her clients, overwhelmed by the terrifying machinery of the justice system. Camille wasn't speaking like a lawyer, she was speaking like a sister, like a friend. Her hand was resting gently on the young woman's arm, a small gesture of comfort and solidarity. She spoke in a low, soothing voice, her words inaudible to Kevin. But the effect was clear. The young woman's sobs began to subside, her posture straightening slightly as she listened to Camille's quiet words of reassurance. Kevin was moved by the scene. Here was the woman Greg Hale had tried to paint as an incompetent amateur, and she was showing more compassion and decency in this one quiet moment than Greg had shown in his entire career. The contrast was staggering. He felt a sudden impulsive need to do something, to offer some small gesture of support. He took a deep breath and approached them. "Excuse me, Miss Bryant," he said, his voice a little shaky. Camille looked up, her expression calm and questioning. She gave the young client's arm a final reassuring squeeze before turning her full attention to him. "Yes? My name is Kevin Tran. I'm a clerk in Judge Stone's courtroom," he said, extending a hand. "I saw what happened in there today, and I just wanted to say, I thought the way you handled yourself was incredible." A small, genuine smile touched Camille's lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it transformed her face, softening the intense focus he had seen in court. "Thank you, Kevin," she said, shaking his hand. Her grip was firm and confident. "I appreciate that." Kevin hesitated for a moment, then plunged ahead, feeling a surge of conviction. "Look, I know this is unorthodox," he said, lowering his voice, "but our court records everything. There's a video file of the entire proceeding, including Mr. Hale's outburst. I know it's not my place, but if you ever needed it for a complaint, for a report to the bar, I could make sure you got a copy." He knew he was taking a risk. Offering to leak court evidence, even for a good cause, could cost him his job. But in that moment he didn't care. He felt a moral imperative to act. Camille's smile widened slightly. She seemed to see right through him, to understand the risk he was taking, and the reasons behind it. "Thank you, Kevin," she said again, her voice warm. "That is a very kind and honorable offer." She paused, a thoughtful, almost mysterious look in her eyes. "I have a feeling that particular recording will find its way into the right hands very soon." Then she added, with a hint of a twinkle in her eye, "Don't be surprised if you see me again soon, perhaps in a different light." Kevin didn't fully understand what she meant. A different light? Was she moving to a different department? A private firm? He was puzzled, But he also felt a strange sense of excitement, a feeling that he had just stumbled into the first chapter of a much larger story. He felt, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that he had chosen the right side. He nodded, a new sense of purpose solidifying within him. "I'll be looking forward to it," he said. As he walked away, he glanced back one last time. Camille was once again focused on her client, a quiet warrior fighting battles that no one else could see. And Kevin knew, without a doubt, that he had just met someone extraordinary. Greg Hale was on a victory lap. Back at the firm, he gathered his team, including the sycophantic junior associates and a new group of bright-eyed summer interns, in one of the smaller but still luxurious conference rooms. He was reliving his courtroom triumph, embellishing the details with each telling, casting himself as the heroic defender of corporate justice against the onslaught of social justice warriors. "And then she just stood there," he said, pacing back and forth, reenacting the scene with theatrical flair, trying to pull some kind of black girl power act, looking at the jury with those big sad eyes. He rolled his eyes dramatically, and some of the interns exchanged uncomfortable glances. His mockery felt sour, like a joke that had gone on too long and turned mean. "But you can't let them get to you," he lectured, pointing at the young lawyers. "You have to be ruthless. You have to remind them who owns the courtroom." He slammed his hand on the polished table for emphasis. "And make no mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimidating growl, "I own this court." His arrogance, already at a fever pitch, seemed to be escalating into something nastier, something more tyrannical. He was no longer just gloating about his victory over Camille. He was using it as a cautionary tale, a warning to his own underlings about the consequences of crossing him. The atmosphere in the room grew tense. The initial excitement of listening to a top partner's war stories had curdled into a palpable discomfort. Greg, however, was completely oblivious. He was lost in the echo chamber of his own voice, high on his own perceived power. "I've seen it all," he boasted, leaning back in his chair. "I've seen ambitious junior partners who thought they were smarter than me. You know what I did?" He paused for dramatic effect. "I froze their account. I made a few calls and suddenly their credit cards stopped working. Their mortgages were under review. I had them out on the street within a week." He chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. The interns stared at him, their faces pale. The junior associates fidgeted with their pens, avoiding eye contact with each other. This wasn't a lesson in law, it was a lesson in cruelty. He was admitting to destroying people's lives over petty grudges, and he was proud of it. "And the underperformers," he went on, a cruel glint in his eye. "The ones who couldn't keep up. Fired, no severance, no goodbyes, just a box for their things and security escorting them out the door. You have to be decisive. You have to cut out the weakness before it spreads." He smiled, a thin, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "That's how Hale and Dawson stays at the top. We don't tolerate failure. We don't tolerate dissent." His laughter, loud and hollow, echoed in the silent, uncomfortable room. It bounced off the expensive wood paneling and the glass walls, a sound full of self-admiration and devoid of any humanity. As his laughter faded, the camera of the mind's eye would symbolically zoom in on the ornate brass nameplate on the conference room door. Hale and Dawson. The name, which he spoke with such proprietary pride, seemed to waver for a moment, a temporary fixture about to be torn down. The foundation he believed to be solid rock was, in reality, nothing but sand, and the tide was about to come in with a force that would wash his entire legacy away. He was a king celebrating in a castle that had already been sold, completely unaware that his reign was, for all intents and purposes, already over. The city lights twinkled outside the panoramic windows of the Bryant Legal Holdings headquarters. The bustling energy of the day had given way to the quiet hum of the late night. Most of the city was asleep, but Camille Bryant was wide awake. She sat in her office, not in the modest suit of the public defender, but in a simple, comfortable silk blouse and slacks. The fire she had so carefully controlled in the courtroom was now a focused, steady flame in her eyes. The time for observation was over. The time for action had arrived. She picked up her sleek, encrypted smartphone and made a call. There was no small talk, no preamble. Her voice was calm, clear, and decisive. "Maria," she said, addressing her chief operating officer. "Execute phase 2. On the other end of the line, Maria, who had been waiting for this call, replied with a simple, "Consider it done." That was it. That was the signal. With those 3 words, a cascade of actions was set in motion. Digital files were unsealed. Secure emails were sent to every partner and employee of Hale and Dawson. The final legal paperwork, which had been held in escrow, was officially filed with the state and the Bar Association. The acquisition, which had been a closely guarded secret, was now a public and legal fact. The firm of Hale and Dawson, as it had existed for 50 years, was no more. It was now officially and legally a subsidiary of Bryant Legal Holdings. The name on the door had not yet changed, but the name on the deed had. Camille disconnected the call and immediately dialed another number. This call was different. It was not to an employee, but to an ally. "Judge Stone," she said, her voice warm with respect. "It's Camille Bryant. I apologize for the late hour." "Not at all, Camille." Judge Rebecca Stone's voice came through the line, steady and reassuring. The judge had been a mentor to Camille for years, one of the few people who knew the truth behind her meteoric rise. She was aware of the acquisition, aware of Camille's history with the firm, and had agreed to play her part in the final act. "I trust everything is in place. Phase 2 has been executed," Camille confirmed. "The official announcement will hit their inboxes any minute now. There will be an emergency board meeting summoned for 9 a.m. sharp tomorrow." "And Mr. Hale?" the judge asked, a hint of weariness in her voice. She had presided over Gregory Hale's courtroom antics for years. "He is, as you predicted, completely unaware," Camille said. "His performance in your courtroom today was illuminating. It confirmed everything I needed to know." There was a pause, and then Judge Stone said, with a quiet firmness that Camille deeply respected, "He won't see it coming. The board will be there. I will ensure the transition is recognized by the court. They will have no choice but to comply." Camille felt a wave of gratitude. "Thank you, Rebecca. For everything." "Justice comes in many forms, Camille," the judge replied. "Sometimes it's swift and loud, and sometimes," she paused, "it walks in quietly on the arm of a public defender. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Camille hung up the phone. She stood and walked to the window, looking down at the sprawling city below. Down there, in a luxurious apartment, Gregory Hale was probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of his own greatness, completely oblivious to the fact that his world had been dismantled while he slept. Camille felt no glee, no triumphant joy. She felt a quiet, somber sense of completion. This wasn't a celebration. It was a reckoning. She had prepared for this day for years, and now, with everything in place, she felt a profound and steady calm. The storm was about to break, and she was its quiet, silent center. The next morning, the atmosphere at Hale and Dawson was one of confusion and nervous energy. The secure email from Bryant Legal Holdings had landed in every inbox at precisely 11:00 p.m. the previous night. It was formal, cryptic, and non-negotiable. It announced an immediate change in senior management and summoned all partners and executive staff to an emergency meeting in the main boardroom at 9:00 a.m. No reason was given. No further details were provided. The email was signed by a name no one recognized. Camille Bryant, CEO Bryant Legal Holdings. The news spread through the firm like wildfire. Partners called each other in hushed, panicked tones. Assistants whispered theories by the coffee machine. Who was Bryant Legal Holdings? What did change in senior management mean? Was this a hostile takeover? A merger? A bankruptcy? Gregory Hale, however, was immune to the panic. When his assistant, a nervous young woman named Sarah, brought him the printed-out email, he barely glanced at it. Bryant Legal Holdings, he scoffed, mispronouncing the name. Never heard of them. Probably some tech startup that needs a real lawyer. He was still riding the high of the previous day. He was invincible. The king of his castle. An emergency meeting didn't scare him. It intrigued him. He assumed it was about some new lucrative case. Or perhaps the other partners were finally going to officially recognize him as the managing partner for life. He saw the summons not as a threat, but as another stage for him to command. He arrived at the boardroom at precisely 9 a.m., not a minute early or late. He strode in with his usual air of supreme confidence, a smug smile already playing on his lips. But the scene that greeted him was not what he expected. The firm's grand boardroom, with its 30-foot mahogany table and sweeping city views, was already filled, but the faces staring back at him were not just his partners. There were several unfamiliar men and women, all dressed in expensive, conservative suits, their faces impassive and serious. They radiated a quiet, powerful energy that was very different from the boisterous arrogance of his own partners. These were the senior executives from Bryant Legal Holdings, the team Camille had built to run her empire. At one end of the table, looking nervous but resolute, sat Kevin Tran. He had received a personal invitation from Camille's office that morning, requesting his presence as a representative from the clerk's office to validate certain documents. He didn't know exactly what was about to happen, but he knew it was the different light Camille had spoken of. He clutched a file folder containing a certified copy of the courtroom video, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Greg paused in the doorway, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second as he took in the strange scene, but his ego quickly reasserted itself. He waved a dismissive hand at the unfamiliar faces. "Well, look at this," he boomed, trying to seize control of the room. "Full house. I hope this is important. I've got a tea time at noon." He walked toward his customary seat at the head of the table, completely ignoring the fact that it was already occupied by one of the stoic executives. He pulled up a different chair, still posturing, still performing. He looked around at the grim faces and let out a short, forced laugh. "Hope nobody's getting fired today," he joked, his voice echoing in the tense, silent room. The irony was so thick, so perfectly complete, that it was almost painful. He had delivered his own punchline, completely unaware that he was the butt of the joke. The executives from Bryant Legal Holdings simply stared at him, their expressions unchanging. His own partners chicketed uncomfortably in their seats, their faces a mask of anxiety. Kevin Tran just watched, his breath held tight in his chest, waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act. Just as Greg's clueless joke hung in the dead air, the grand boardroom doors swung open with a soft, authoritative swoosh. Every head in the room turned. Standing in the doorway was Camille Bryant. The transformation was breathtaking. The modest gray suit was gone, replaced by an elegant navy blue tailored pantsuit that screamed power and sophistication. Her hair was styled in soft, professional waves that framed a face set with calm, unshakable confidence. She wore no flashy jewelry, only a simple, classic watch on her wrist. She didn't need adornments. Her presence was the statement. She walked into the room with a slow, deliberate grace, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, a sound that seemed to count down the final seconds of Greg Hale's career. The chattering whispers and nervous coughs died instantly. A profound silence fell over the room, a silence born of shock and awe. She was no longer the invisible public defender. She was the most powerful person in the room, and everyone knew it instinctively. Kevin Tran's eyes widened in stunned recognition. His mind struggled to reconcile the image of this commanding, elegant woman with the humble, quietly resilient public defender he had met on the courthouse steps. This was the different light she had spoken of. It was like watching a superhero reveal their true identity. A slow smile spread across his face as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. He finally understood. This wasn't just about a courtroom insult. This was about something much, much bigger. Greg Hale's reaction was slower, a train of thought derailing in real time. His smug smirk faltered, then completely vanished. His eyes widened, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. He recognized her, of course, but the context was all wrong. What was the little public defender from yesterday doing here? Why was she dressed like that? Why was everyone staring at her as if she were a queen? He looked around at his partners, seeking an explanation, but they were all staring at Camille, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. No one would meet his gaze. Camille walked to the head of the table, to the seat Greg had always considered his own. The executive who had been sitting there stood respectfully as she approached. Camille didn't sit down. She stood at the head of the table, a queen surveying her new kingdom. She placed a thick, leather-bound folder on the polished surface, with a soft but definitive thud. The sound seemed to break the spell of silence.
"Good morning, everyone," she said. Her voice was the same calm, clear tone she had used in the courtroom, but in this context, it carried an entirely different weight. It was not the voice of someone asking for permission. It was the voice of someone in absolute command. She let her gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of every single person at the table, When her eyes finally landed on Greg, they were cool and unreadable, devoid of anger or triumph. They simply held him in a steady, assessing gaze that made the blood drain from his face. "For those of you who don't know me," she continued, her voice echoing in the silent room, "my name is Camille Bryant. I am the founder and CEO of Bryant Legal Holdings." She paused, letting the name sink in. The same name Greg had scoffed at just an hour earlier, and, she added, her voice dropping slightly but losing none of its power, effective as of 11 p.m. last night, Bryant Legal Holdings is the sole owner and parent company of this firm. The words detonated in the room like a silent bomb. A collective gasp went through the partners of Hale and Dawson. One of the older partners put his head in his hands. Another's jaw had literally dropped, his mouth hanging open in slack-jawed disbelief. But all eyes were on Greg Hale. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, pale white. He looked as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He stammered, making a small, choking sound, like a fish pulled from water. The arrogant, untouchable king of the courtroom was gone. In his place was a sputtering, terrified old man, who was just beginning to understand that his castle was built on sand, and the tide had just come in.
Greg Hale struggled to form a coherent thought. His mind was a whirlwind of denial and confusion. This is a joke," he finally managed to stammer, his voice a hoarse whisper, a pathetic shadow of its usual booming baritone. "This is some kind of ridiculous, elaborate joke." Camille did not grace his sputtering with a direct reply. She simply opened the thick folder in front of her. Her movements were calm, precise, and methodical. "It's no joke, Mr. Hale," she said, her voice cutting through his panic like a surgeon's scalpel. "It's a business transaction, one that has been in the works for over a year." She slid the top document across the polished table. It was the signed and notarized acquisition agreement. His partners leaned in, their faces ashen as they recognized the signatures of the firm's senior equity partners, signatures obtained during secret negotiations they had been excluded from. They had been sold out by their own. "As the new owner of this firm," Camille continued, her voice maintaining its steady, implacable rhythm, "I have a fiduciary duty to assess all assets and liabilities, and that includes personnel." Her eyes locked onto Greg's. "Unfortunately, Mr. Hale, your conduct represents a significant liability to this company." She then pulled out a series of other documents from the folder.
"I have here," she said, laying them out one by one, "a file detailing multiple internal complaints filed against you over the past decade. Complaints of harassment, discrimination, and creating a hostile work environment. Complaints that were, it seems, systematically buried by the previous management." She gestured toward his now former partners, who shrank under her gaze. Next, she slid another document forward. "This is a deposition from a former junior partner, whom you boasted about freezing the accounts of. He is prepared to testify in a civil suit regarding your tortious interference with his career." Greg's face, already pale, seemed to turn a shade of gray. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He looked like a man watching his life's work burn to the ground in slow motion. And then, Camille turned her gaze to the end of the table. "Kevin," she said, her voice softening slightly. "If you would," Kevin Tran, his heart pounding but his hands steady, stood up. He opened his own folder and slid a small portable tablet to the center of the table. "Pursuant to the court's official record-keeping," Kevin stated, his voice clear and formal, "this is certified video footage from yesterday's proceedings in courtroom 4B. He pressed play. The screen flickered to life, and the boardroom was filled with the sound of Greg Hale's own voice, dripping with arrogance and disdain. They all watched in stunned silence as the ugly scene unfolded again. They heard him mock Camille, call her just the public defender, and sneer about diversity hires. They saw his contemptuous gestures, his smearing face, his public humiliation of the woman who now owned his entire world. Watching it now, in the cold, sterile light of the boardroom, it was even more damning than it had been in the moment. It was a portrait of pure, unadulterated hubris. When the clip ended, the silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. No one dared to speak. The partners stared at the table, their faces a mask of shame and fear. Greg Hale was frozen, his jaw slack,
his eyes wide with a look of pure, uncomprehending horror. He had been so proud of that moment. He had seen it as a demonstration of his power. Now he saw it for what it was: a self-inflicted wound, a public execution of his own character, delivered by his own hand. Camille let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy moment before delivering the final blow. Her voice was not angry or triumphant. It was calm, factual, and utterly final. Due to this pattern of misconduct, your documented history of creating a toxic and legally liable work environment, and the gross unprofessionalism demonstrated in this video, she stated, Bryant Legal Holdings is terminating your employment, effective immediate. She slid one last piece of paper across the table. It was a single-page termination letter. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings. You will be out of the building in 1 hour. Greg just stared at the paper, his mind unable to process the words, fired. Gregory Hale. It was impossible. He tried to speak, to object, to threaten, but no words came. His entire arsenal of bluster and intimidation was gone, rendered useless. He was powerless. Kevin Tran, from his seat at the end of the table, discreetly lifted his phone, and hidden beneath the level of the table, pressed record. He wasn't doing it out of malice, but out of a sense of historical justice. The man who had tried to publicly shame Camille deserved to have his own private downfall documented. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and it was even more devastating than he could have imagined. The story of Greg Hale's spectacular fall from grace spread through the courthouse, with the speed of gossip in a small town. By the time Camille Bryant walked back into courtroom 4B later that afternoon to finalize a procedural matter for her pro bono case, the air was electric with whispers. Junior lawyers and clerks huddled in corners, speaking in hushed tones. Interns who had been in the conference room that morning recounted the story with a mixture of terror and awe. The narrative was the same everywhere. The quiet public defender was secretly a corporate titan, and she had fired the firm's most arrogant partner on his own turf. The courtroom, which had been Greg's stage just 24 hours earlier, now felt like a theater waiting for the final scene. Camille entered quietly, taking her seat at the public defender's table. She was once again in her simple, modest suit, the powerful CEO once again hidden beneath a cloak of humility. She was no longer a mystery. She was a legend. But her demeanor had not changed. She was still calm, still focused, still respectful of the institution she stood in. When Judge Rebecca Stone entered the courtroom, she took her seat at the bench and surveyed the room. Her eyes, sharp and knowing, passed over the faces of the lawyers, the clerks, and the gallery, all buzzing with the news. Then her gaze rested on Camille. A long, profound silence fell over the courtroom as everyone waited to see what would happen. Judge Stone, a woman who commanded respect through her wisdom and authority, slowly, deliberately, rose to her feet. A judge standing for an attorney was a rare and powerful gesture, a sign of the utmost respect. It was an act that silenced every whisper and drew every eye. "Good afternoon, Miss Bryant," Judge Stone said, her voice clear and formal, resonating with the full weight of her office. Then she added the word that sealed Greg Hale's fate and cemented Camille's new status in the legal community. Ma'am. The word hung in the air, a simple title imbued with immense power. She had not called her counselor. She had called her ma'am, the honorific reserved for figures of the highest authority, a title of respect she had never once bestowed upon Greg Hale. In that single moment, Camille's victory was made public and undeniable. The entire court, including Greg's former interns and the junior lawyers who had once nervously chuckled at his jokes, stared in frozen, stunned silence. Their jaws were agape. They were witnessing a seismic shift in the power dynamics of their world. The woman who had been dismissed and humiliated was now being publicly honored by the highest authority in the room. At that exact moment, at the back of the courtroom, the doors opened. 2 security guards were escorting a dazed and shattered Gregory Hale through the hallway. He was being led out of the building after his humiliating exit from the firm. He happened to glance into the courtroom just in time to see Judge Stone standing for Camille. He saw the looks of awe on the faces of his former colleagues. He heard the judge call her ma'am. It was the final crushing blow. The last shred of his arrogance, the last ember of his self-importance, collapsed into dust. His shoulders slumped in utter defeat, a man publicly and completely broken. He was escorted away, a ghost haunting the halls where he once reigned as a king. Camille, from her table, simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the judge. Then her eyes found Kevin Tran, who was standing by his clerk's desk, watching the scene unfold with a look of profound satisfaction. Camille gave him a quiet, grateful nod, a silent acknowledgement of his courage, his integrity, and his loyalty. It was a promise kept. A new era had begun, not with a bang, but with a quiet, dignified gesture of respect. The fall was as swift as it was brutal. One day, Gregory Hale was a titan of the legal world. The next, he was a pariah. The news of his termination for gross misconduct was officially and very publicly announced by Bryant Legal Holdings. The carefully worded press release left no room for ambiguity. He was disgraced. The process of erasing him from the firm he had helped build began immediately. He was given one cardboard box to pack the personal contents of his opulent office. Framed photos with powerful politicians, awards from the Bar Association, expensive decanters, they all went into the box. A sad collection of relics from a former life. He packed in a humiliated silence as a stoic security guard watched his every move. His former partners, the men who had shared drinks and celebrated victories with him for decades, now avoided his calls. They were too busy trying to save their own careers, scrambling to curry favor with the new ownership. His so-called friends in the legal community suddenly grew distant. The invitations to exclusive golf clubs and charity galas stopped coming. His social media accounts, once a platform for his boasts, went silent, frozen in time. The machine of power and influence that he had so masterfully operated was now being used against him. An internal audit, ordered by Camille, had put a freeze on his bank accounts pending an investigation into his expense reports and billing practices. The credit cards he had once used to threaten a junior partner were now unceremoniously declined. Kevin Tran stood by a window in the clerk's office, which overlooked the main entrance of the Hale and Dawson building. He watched as Greg Hale, a man he had once feared, shuffled out onto the sidewalk, clutching his single cardboard box. He looked smaller, older, and utterly defeated. He tried to hail a cab, but the first one sped past him, its driver not recognizing the once powerful lawyer. The speed of the reversal was stunning. Kevin felt not pity, but a sense of profound and necessary justice. It was a stark reminder that arrogance is a hollow shield, easily shattered by the quiet force of truth. A few days later, a team of workers arrived at the building. With professional efficiency, they removed the large brass letters from above the main entrance that spelled out Hale and Dawson. Kevin watched from the window as the old name came down, letter by letter. An hour later, they were replaced with a new sign, its letters gleaming in the afternoon sun. The new nameplate was simple, elegant, and powerful. It read, Bryant and Stone Legal. Camille, in a gesture of respect and partnership, had offered Judge Stone a senior counsel position upon her eventual retirement from the bench, naming the new firm in her honor. It was a symbol of a new beginning, a new culture built not on ego and intimidation, but on integrity and respect. The ghost of Gregory Hale had been exorcised, and a new, more just foundation was being laid in its place. In the weeks that followed, Camille Bryant did not rest on her victory. She began the difficult, meticulous work of transforming the toxic culture of the firm she now owned. Memos were sent out, new policies were implemented, and a zero-tolerance policy for harassment and discrimination was established. But her most important changes were personal. One of her first official acts as the head of the newly christened Bryant and Stone Legal was to call Kevin Tran to her office. Kevin walked in nervously, unsure of what to expect. He found Camille not behind her massive desk, but sitting in one of the comfortable chairs by the window, a warm and welcoming smile on her face. Kevin, she said, gesturing for him to sit, I wanted to thank you again. What you did took courage. You stood up for what was right, even at great personal risk. That is a quality that is far too rare, and it's a quality I value above all else. She then slid a folder across the coffee table toward him. This firm needs people like you, she continued, people with a strong moral compass. I've reviewed your records. You're smart, you're dedicated, and you have a law degree you haven't been using. I would like to offer you a position as a junior associate, effective immediately. Your first assignment will be to help me build a new pro bono department, one with real resources and a real mission to serve our community. Kevin was speechless. He stared at the offer letter, a life-changing opportunity handed to him not because of who he knew, but because of who he was. He had been seen. He had been valued. He accepted with a voice thick with emotion, his belief in justice renewed and strengthened. The final scene of the story is not in a boardroom or a courtroom, but in a quiet, peaceful cemetery on a sunny afternoon. Camille stands before a simple, well-tended grave. The headstone reads, Samuel Bryant, a loving father, a man of dignity. The roar of the city is a distant hum here. The air is still. She reaches into her blazer pocket and pulls out a crisp, new business card. She kneels down and gently places the card on the grass next to the headstone. The card reads, Camille Bryant, Managing Partner Bryant & Stone Legal. She rests her hand on the cool stone of the grave, a silent communion with the father, whose memory had fueled her long and difficult journey. She had not just avenged him, she had honored him. She had built an empire not of vengeance, but of principle. She had fulfilled a silent promise made long ago, turning a story of pain and injustice into a legacy of strength and integrity. As the camera of the mind pulls back, the final narration begins, a voiceover that captures the heart of the story for everyone watching. Power isn't always loud. It doesn't always come dressed in an expensive suit, shouting from the rooftops of its own success. Sometimes true power is quiet. It's patient. It walks humbly, wearing a cloak of modesty, observing and waiting for the right moment to speak. It isn't about tearing others down to build yourself up. It's about having a foundation so strong, a purpose so clear, that your quiet truth becomes more powerful than the loudest lie. It's a reminder that character is not what you show to the world when you are on top, but how you treat the people you believe are beneath you. For in the end, it is not arrogance that endures, but dignity. And it is not pride that wins, but purpose. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.